Padre Pio said that the most dangerous act of spiritual warfare is not exorcism, not fasting, not even intercessory prayer for the dying. It is blessing someone who hates you. Because when you speak grace over an enemy, you do not simply offer them mercy, you set in motion something ancient, something beyond human understanding, something that shakes both the spiritual and physical realms in ways that cannot be undone. He saw it happen once. A single act of blessing, spoken over hatred, that became a collision between two eternal forces, one soul ascending, one soul descending, and in the space between them, a revelation so profound that Padre Pio carried it in silence for years, afraid of what it meant. Not because blessing fails, but because it always works. And the consequences are far greater than we imagine. Before we continue, please consider subscribing to the channel and letting us know where you're watching from. We read every single comment and truly appreciate you taking the time to listen to the story. It was late March of 1958, deep into the hours when even the monastery itself seemed to hold its breath, when the stone walls of San Giovanni Rotondo grew cold, not from the night air but from something else, something that pressed against the visible world like a hand against glass. Padre Pio knelt beside his narrow bed, rosary beads worn smooth between his fingers, his stigmatized hands wrapped in cloth that had long since soaked through with blood and serum, his breath visible in the sudden chill that filled his cell. He had been praying for hours, offering the pain of his wounds for souls he would never meet, for conversions he would never witness, for battles fought in realms he could see but never touch. And then the air changed, not dramatically, not with thunder or wind or the scent of sulfur. It changed the way water changes when something rises from beneath the surface. Slowly, inevitably. He did not lift his head. He did not open his eyes. He simply waited, because he knew a soul had entered his cell. Not a demon, not an angel. A human soul, newly departed, hovering in that terrible space between the last breath and the first reckoning. She appeared not as light or shadow, but as something caught between both, a figure translucent and trembling, her face blank with confusion, her hands reaching out toward walls she could no longer touch. She was middle-aged, her house dress faded and worn, her hair gray and unkempt, her expression not twisted in agony but frozen in the slow, creeping realization that something was profoundly, irreversibly wrong. She did not scream. She did not weep. She simply stood there at the threshold of his cell, her lips moving without sound, her eyes scanning the room as though searching for something familiar, something solid, something that would tell her she was still alive. Padre Pio finally opened his eyes and looked at her, and his face did not register surprise or fear, but a deep, unbearable sorrow. He recognized her immediately, not because they had been close, not because she had ever spoken kindly to him, but because for 15 years, every single morning after Mass, he had whispered her name in prayer and blessed her, even though she had cursed his. Her name was Agnès, a woman from the village who had despised him with a quiet, relentless hatred, who had spread rumors that his wounds were self-inflicted, who had mocked him in the marketplace, who had spat on the ground when his shadow passed over her doorstep. And yet, he had blessed her, every day, without fail, without hesitation. And now she stood before him, her soul suspended in the space between mercy and judgment, and she did not yet understand why. Agnès stood in the center of the cell, her form flickering like candlelight in a draught, her eyes darting from corner to corner, as though searching for an exit that did not exist. And when she finally spoke, her voice came out thin and brittle, trembling not with reverence but with rising panic. "Where am I?" she demanded, her words sharp and accusing, directed at Padre Pio, as though he were responsible for her displacement, as though he had pulled her from her kitchen and deposited her in this cold, unfamiliar place without permission or explanation. He did not answer. He remained kneeling beside his bed, his hands still folded in prayer, his gaze fixed upon her with an expression that was not judgment but something far more devastating: pity. She took a step toward him, her movements strange and weightless, as though she were walking through water, and the frustration in her voice deepened into something closer to fear. "Why are you looking at me like that?" she said, her tone accusatory, defensive, as though his sorrow were an insult she could not tolerate. "Why am I here? I was in my home. I was preparing supper." I felt dizzy. I sat down, and then her words trailed off, her brow furrowing as she tried to reconstruct the sequence of events, but the memory dissolved before she could grasp it, leaving only the sensation of falling, of cold air rushing past her, of a door closing somewhere far away. Padre Pio's lips moved in silent prayer, his eyes never leaving her face, and the silence between them grew heavier, thicker, pressing down on the room like the weight of stone. Agnese turned away from him, her breath quickening, and reached out toward the wall, her hand extending toward the rough surface of the monastery stone, as though to steady herself, as though to prove that the world was still solid, still real, still bound by the laws she had always known. But her fingers passed through the wall, not slowly, not with resistance. They simply passed through, as though the stone were nothing more than mist, as though her hand no longer belonged to the same realm as the wall. And she gasped, pulling her arm back and staring at her own palm as though it had betrayed her. She tried again. Again, her hand passed through. She turned to the small wooden table beside Padre Pio's bed and reached for the rosary lying there, but her fingers closed on nothing, grasping at air where solid beads should have been, and the realization began to settle over her. Not with fire, not with thunder, not with the dramatic clarity she had always imagined death would bring, but with the slow, suffocating weight of truth, pressing down on her chest, stealing her breath, unraveling the last threads of denial she had clung to. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her voice barely audible now, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "No, this isn't. I'm not." But the words would not come, because somewhere deep within her, beneath the panic and the confusion and the stubborn refusal to accept what was happening, she knew. She had known the moment she appeared in this cell. She had known the moment she felt the coldness that was not cold, the weightlessness that was not lightness, the silence that was not peace. She was dead. And Padre Pio, kneeling in his blood-stained wrappings, watching her with eyes full of unbearable sorrow, had been waiting for her to understand. Agnese's voice rose, not in acceptance but in defiance, in the desperate scramble of a soul clinging to the identity it had built for itself in life, the carefully constructed narrative of righteousness that had always shielded her from doubt. "I was a good person," she said, her words sharp and insistent, thrown at Padre Pio like accusations, like demands for vindication. "I attended Mass every Sunday. I prayed the rosary. I fasted during Lent. I gave alms to the poor. I followed the rules. I did everything I was supposed to do." Her voice cracked slightly, the edges fraying, but she pushed forward, her hands gesturing wildly as though she could somehow reconstruct the evidence of her virtue in the air between them. "I raised my children in the faith. I never committed adultery. I never stole. I never blasphemed. I was faithful. I was obedient. I was." But Padre Pio interrupted her, not with harshness, not with condemnation, but with a single question spoken so quietly it seemed to come not from his lips but from the silence itself. "Did you ever bless me?" The question hung in the air, and Agnese froze, her mouth still open, her words dying before they could form, and for a long moment she simply stared at him, her expression shifting from confusion to something sharper, something defensive and cornered. "What?" she whispered, as though she had not heard him correctly, as though the question itself were an accusation she could not comprehend. Padre Pio did not repeat himself. He only waited, his eyes holding hers with a steadiness that was unbearable, that stripped away every excuse, every justification, every carefully rehearsed defense she had prepared. And slowly, reluctantly, the truth began to surface. I hated you, she admitted, the words forced out through clenched teeth, her face twisting with the bitterness she had carried for so long. I thought you were a fraud, a charlatan, a man who manipulated the simple-minded with theatrics and superstition. Those wounds on your hands, I thought you inflicted them yourself. I thought you were deceiving people, taking their money, taking their devotion, feeding on their desperation like a parasite. Her voice grew louder, more accusatory, as though by speaking the hatred aloud she could somehow justify it, transform it into something righteous. I mocked you in the marketplace. I told everyone who would listen that you were a fake, that your visions were delusions, that your stigmata were self-mutilation. I turned people against you. I warned mothers to keep their daughters away from you. I spat on the ground when your shadow crossed my path. She paused, her breath coming faster now, her hands trembling. And when you passed me in the street that day, when you looked at me with those eyes, when you whispered that blessing over me, I recoiled. I pulled away from you as though you were diseased. I refused it. I cursed you under my breath. I went home and washed my face as though your words had contaminated me. The confession poured out of her, not with relief but with the bitter satisfaction of someone who believed their hatred had been justified, who still clung to the narrative that she had been right, that he had been wrong, that her cruelty had been a form of moral clarity. But Padre Pio did not argue. He did not defend himself. He did not correct her distorted perceptions or challenge her accusations. He simply repeated the question, his voice even softer now, even more devastating in its simplicity. Did you ever bless me? And this time, Agnès could not answer, because the answer was no. She had never blessed him, not once, not in 15 years, not even in the secrecy of her own prayers. And in the silence that followed, the truth began to unravel, pulling thread after thread from the fabric of justifications she had woven around herself, until there was nothing left but the bare, undeniable reality of what she had refused to do. The cell dissolved around her, the walls fading like ink in water, and Agnès found herself pulled not forward but backward, not into judgment but into memory, and the memories were not her own. She saw Padre Pio kneeling in this same cell, night after night, year after year, his stigmatized hands clasped before the crucifix, his lips moving in silent prayer, and she heard her name, Agnès, spoken not with bitterness, not with resentment, not with the wounded pride of a man who had been mocked and slandered, but with tenderness, with sorrow, with desperate intercession. She saw him offering his sufferings for her conversion, saw him pressing his bleeding hands against his chest as he begged God to have mercy on her soul, saw him weeping before the crucifix with a grief so profound it shook his entire body, and the sight of it broke something inside her because she had never known, had never suspected, had never imagined that while she was spreading poison about him in the marketplace, he was offering his pain for her salvation. She saw the moment in the street, the moment she had dismissed as theatrical manipulation, but now she saw it from his perspective. She saw herself approaching, her face already hardened with contempt, her eyes cold and dismissive, and she saw him turn toward her, not with anger but with compassion, and she heard the blessing he whispered over her, quiet and sincere, a prayer for her peace, for her healing, for her protection from the darkness she did not know was gathering around her. And then she saw what happened in the unseen realm. The instant his blessing touched the air between them, the spiritual atmosphere erupted. Angels descended, drawn to the point of contact between grace and hatred, their presence blazing with light that pierced through layers of reality she had never known existed. But demons came too, drawn by the scent of her refusal, by the opportunity her bitterness created, by the opening her hatred provided. She saw them colliding in the space above the cobblestone street, a battle invisible to human eyes but devastating in its intensity. And she saw the moment she recoiled from his blessing, the moment she cursed him under her breath, the moment she chose hatred over grace. And in that instant, something shifted. Not in the angels, not in the demons, in her. A wound opened in her soul, small at first, barely noticeable, a hairline fracture in the foundation of her spirit. But it did not heal. It festered, it spread, it hardened into bitterness, into resentment, into a blindness that grew deeper with every passing year. She saw how every act of cruelty she committed afterward was rooted in that single refusal. The rumors she spread were not born from righteous discernment, but from the poison that wound had released into her heart. The people she turned against Padre Pio were not protected by her warnings, but infected by her bitterness. The children she raised in the faith inherited not devotion but suspicion, not love but judgment, not mercy but the same hardness that had calcified around her own soul. She saw the consequences ripple outward, touching lives she would never meet, wounding souls she would never know, creating fractures in families and communities that would take generations to heal. And she saw that none of it was punishment. God had not struck her down. God had not turned away from her. The wound was self-inflicted, the prison self-constructed, the darkness self-chosen. Every day, Padre Pio had offered her a way out. Every blessing he spoke was a key to the cell she had locked herself inside, but she had refused. Again and again and again. Not because the key did not work, but because she could not bring herself to believe that grace could come through the hands of a man she despised. The vision ended, and Agnese collapsed, not physically because she had no body left to collapse with, but spiritually, the architecture of her justifications crumbling, the walls of her denial shattering, leaving her exposed and trembling in a way she had never been exposed in life. She knelt there in the dissolved space that was no longer a cell, no longer a street, no longer anywhere she could name, and the weight of what she had seen pressed down on her with such force that she could not speak, could not breathe, could not do anything but feel the full measure of what she had refused for 15 years. And then, from somewhere deep within her, from a place she did not know still existed, the words rose, not defiant, not bitter, not laced with the sarcasm or contempt that had poisoned her speech for so long, but quiet, broken, sincere. I bless you, Padre Pio. The words left her lips like a confession, like a surrender, like the final unlocking of a door she had bolted shut from the inside, and the moment they touched the air, everything changed. The coldness that had surrounded her since the moment of her death began to lift, not all at once, not with the dramatic sweep of divine intervention she had always imagined salvation would require, but slowly, gently, like frost melting under the first rays of morning sun. The weight that had pressed against her chest, the suffocating heaviness that had made every breath an agony, began to dissolve, and she felt something she had not felt in years. Lightness. Not the weightlessness of death, but the lightness of release, of chains falling away, of a burden she had carried so long she had forgotten it was not part of her. The darkness that had gathered at the edges of her vision, the cold shadows that had been waiting, watching, began to pull back, retreating not in defeat but in acknowledgement that they no longer had claim to her. She was not condemned. The door to hell, which had stood open and waiting, closed. But neither was she free. She could feel it, could sense it in the way the light that now surrounded her was not the full blaze of heaven but something gentler, something tinged with fire, purification, not punishment, not vengeance, not the wrath of a God who delighted in suffering, but healing. The years of bitterness, the calcified pride, the refusal to extend grace, the wound she had allowed to fester and spread, all of it had to be burned away, stripped from her soul layer by layer. not to satisfy divine justice, but to make her capable of standing in the presence of love itself. Because love, in its purest form, is unbearable to a heart that has hardened itself against it. She understood now. She would be saved, but the cost of her refusal, the years, decades, of unnecessary suffering she had chosen, would have to be endured before she could be whole. Padre Pio watched her, and tears streamed down his face. Not tears of relief or triumph, but tears of sorrow for the pain she would endure, for the time she had wasted, for the grace she had rejected when it had been freely offered every single day. He raised his stigmatized hands, the wounds still bleeding, still fresh, and he whispered a final blessing over her, his voice thick with emotion. "Go in peace, Agnès. Be healed, be made whole, and know that you were never abandoned." And she began to fade, not descending into darkness, not ascending into light, but carried into something in between, into the fire of mercy, into the arms of a God who would not let her go until every trace of the poison she had chosen was burned away, and she could finally receive the love she had spent a lifetime refusing. Padre Pio carried this vision in silence for years, and those who lived with him in the monastery said that after that night, something changed in him. A heaviness settled over his shoulders that never fully lifted, a sorrow that lingered in his eyes even when he smiled, even when he blessed the pilgrims who came seeking his intercession, even when he celebrated Mass and lifted the host toward heaven with his bleeding hands. And when he finally spoke of what he had seen, when he finally broke the silence and shared the story of Agnese with the friars who attended him in his final years, his voice was thick with grief, heavy with a weight that went beyond personal pain and touched something deeper, something that echoed the sorrow of God himself, watching his children choose chains when freedom was offered. He said that blessing an enemy is not a passive act of piety, not a religious formality to be performed out of obligation or tradition, not a symbolic gesture meant to make us feel virtuous while changing nothing in the spiritual realm. It is a weapon more powerful than exorcism, more devastating than fasting, more dangerous than any prayer of intercession, because it strikes at the root of hatred itself, breaks chains in the unseen realm that have bound souls for generations, calls down torrents of grace into places where only curses existed before, where only bitterness and resentment had been allowed to grow unchecked. But the weapon, he said, works both ways. When we bless those who hate us, when we speak grace over those who have cursed us, mocked us, slandered us, betrayed us, we release them from the grip of darkness. We shatter the chains they have wrapped around themselves. We open doors they did not know were locked. But when we refuse to bless those who have blessed us, when we turn away from grace offered through the hands of those we despise, when we harden our hearts against mercy simply because it comes from a source we have judged unworthy, we do not bind them. We bind ourselves. We become prisoners of our own pride, our own refusal to forgive, our own inability to see that grace is always moving toward us, always reaching for us, always offering us freedom, even through the hands of those we have spent years despising. The soul he saw that night was saved, he said, but only barely, only because in the final moment, when all her justifications had been stripped away and she stood naked before the truth of what she had chosen, she spoke the words she had refused to speak in life. And Padre Pio wept when he told this story, not because she was lost, but because she had wasted so much time, so many years, so many opportunities for joy and peace and communion, all of it traded for bitterness, for the cold satisfaction of hatred, for the hollow victory of being right about a man she had misjudged, when mercy had been waiting for her all along, patient and relentless, never withdrawing, never giving up, never ceasing to offer her the key to her own prison. He said that every soul will face this moment, that there is no escaping it, no avoiding it, no postponing it into some distant future where the stakes will be lower and the choice will be easier. The moment when we must decide to bless or to curse, to forgive or to harden, to receive grace or to turn away from it, to speak love over those who have wounded us, or to nurse the wound until it consumes us. And the choice we make, he said, will echo into eternity, rippling outward through time and space and the unseen realm, shaping not only our own destiny but the destinies of all those our lives will touch. For blessing or for curse, for freedom or for chains,